it's Jamie. This is If You Knew Me, a show where we share powerful stories from the inner lives of women, however they identify. These are first-person stories about topics that women rarely share, even with their closest friends. This week, we have our first ever Where She Is Now episode. We're going back to a woman who previously told her story on our podcast and talking with her about what has happened in her life since she shared her story on the show. It feels most appropriate that our first Where She Is Now episode is with Brinda Berg, the woman who was our first ever podcast guest. Her original episode was entitled Motherless Mother. I can't wait to share Brinda's update with you. Before we dive in, I want to share that we have a goal of reaching 200 show supporters by the end of 2023. I would love you, dear listener, to be one of them. It's just a few bucks a month, and you get super cool extras like upcoming merchandise discounts, behind-the-scenes extras, and the ability to submit ideas for show guests. And if you become a podcast patron before March 1st of this year, you will get a free If You Knew Me coffee mug. There's a photo of the custom mug on our blog and also up on Patreon, so you can check it out. Just go to patreon.com/ifyouknewme and sign up before March 1st for your thank you gift. Okay, so this week we are going back. Brinda Berg told her story on our podcast almost exactly 1 year ago. You can listen to her original story. It's episode number 1 of the show. I'd recommend doing that, but you don't need to listen to that story to follow this episode. Brinda's original story was about losing her mom when she was just 2 years old. She grew up in India, then moved to Singapore, and eventually she landed in the Netherlands. Her story is about how she was raised in the absence of her mother, about lifelong grief, and how losing her mom influences how she raises her own kids. In this follow-up interview, Brinda tells us what it was like to share her story publicly on this podcast, how people in her life reacted, and what shifts and decisions she's made, in part due to sharing her story. This episode is entitled Where She Is Now, Brinda Berg. Brinda, we recorded and shared your story about losing your mom when you were 2 years old and you don't even actually have memories of her, and how that has impacted your whole life. You shared that in the very first episode of our podcast. And I am wondering who you decided to directly share your story with, the podcast story, and how they responded.
So yeah, we did the interview exactly a year ago. I shared it with my really close friends and Dan's family.
Your husband's family.
Yeah, his brothers and his parents and things like that, and also his godmother as well. And I shared it with them. And I think for me, to share it with my side of the family was really, really difficult to do that, in the sense of there's still this sort of hesitation to talk about my mother and the consequences of her death. I didn't want to feel questioned as to why I had shared it or talked about it. I did share it on my Instagram. So there are family members who I have on Instagram. So I don't know who from that has actually heard it. There's still a hesitation behind it to talk about it. Dan's side of the family, though, on the other hand, like really, really openly received it. And they were like, oh, we didn't know this part at all. And it was just so interesting to get a better insight into you and your emotions behind certain things as well. So overall, I would say like I've had a positive reaction to doing the podcast.
The one thing I'm really curious about is if telling your story publicly and telling about this pretty intimate part of your identity, if it in any way influenced your own personal narrative, did it alter your sense of yourself in any way by sharing it publicly?
One part, definitely, and I think it's happened with age as well, where I no longer hold the shame of what happened to me. Whereas before I held on to that shame, I came from this family and I had all of these things happen And I held on to a lot of that shame. And with doing that, it was sort of like letting go of that shame and realizing this has nothing to do with me. It's not who I am at all. And I think that was probably the biggest realization and coming into for me. And going forward, like going through this year, I totally felt like I'm just not shameful of what my life and how it went, and even sharing it and talking about it, because that's the whole thing in the culture that I grew up in. You don't talk about these things. You don't air out your dirty laundry, one might say, because then you're bringing shame to the family. But I didn't do any of these things. None of this. I was like the product of what had happened. And, I don't feel like why I should be carrying that burden with me. So that certainly was a big shift for me since doing the podcast.
Can you point to a moment or an interaction, or is it more subtle than that?
If I look back, I think like certainly when the podcast itself came out and I knew my story was out there, because of course there's that fear of like, oh, what are people going to say about it? How are they going to react? Let's say if my stepmom listened to the podcast, how is she going to react to it? Or if my brother listened to the podcast, how would he react to it? So it was like that kind of a hesitation that I was carrying. But at the same time, it was just this sense of like, but you have a story, and how you felt or how I felt in that case is totally valid and reasonable. And so I think it was the sort of, when the podcast came out, it just like sort of the emotions that came with it, knowing that my story is out there.
So speaking of your stepmom
Mm-hmm.
and also your father, the experiences that you shared in your story,
Yeah.
they are not a glowing review
No.
of your dad.
No.
And I'm wondering, did you share the story? Did you share the podcast episode with him? And if so, how did he respond? Or how has that been since sharing your story?
So I never shared the story with my dad because I have come to realize that my dad has a very narcissistic personality. Everything that was shared would just sort of, fly over his head. Nothing would come in. It wouldn't create any kind of impact at all. So I never shared it with my dad. And I don't know if my stepmom has listened to it, because since they got divorced, I've had no contact with her at all. So I haven't shared it with him. And it's almost like I don't even want to share it with him because I feel like nothing is going to come out of it as a result.
So I've had the opportunity to speak with some women who've been on the podcast about certain decisions that they've made in their life after sharing their story on the podcast, or insights that they've had since sharing their story publicly. And I'm wondering if you've made any important decisions in your life you feel happened in part or in whole because of sharing your story on the podcast.
With sharing the podcast, it made me more aware of the moments when I didn't have my mom, and connecting more things that are happening in my life to that. The other thing also that I think it really helped me do was to really seek a therapist this year, and was very lucky that I was able to see a very good therapist who I think has helped me tremendously. But also just certain things happened in my life since that podcast that have made me now have to let go of certain people in my life, of a certain person specifically in my life, because it was just bringing me so down and affecting me so much. And I didn't realize it at all until I let that person go.
May I ask who that is?
Yeah, my dad. I don't have contact with my biological dad anymore.
The dad who's in the story.
Who's in the story, yeah. I was also just thinking to myself like how to explain it. But it's basically like a wound that was always there, but never bled. And now it's bleeding. Everything that comes with having an open wound and trying to address it and pay attention to it. I'm irritated that I'm having to go through it because I'm like, hey, I was just on this path of trying to figuring out ways of approaching motherhood without having my mom in here. And now this has been thrown into the mix as well.
You mean you were figuring out motherhood without having a mom there?
Yeah. Yeah.
And now you've decided to let go of your father, the relationship with your father, and you're now also parenting without him.
Yeah, parenting without him. And then, also like being confronted with the fact that both my biological parents are not in my life. It's like a very harsh way of having to go through life because he is still alive. I don't know. Maybe I will get in contact with him at some point. But this year I had to take the decision of not having any contact with him. It just has taken away so much of the stress for myself that I put on myself. And it was stress that I didn't realize that even existed within me. And I didn't see this coming. I didn't expect it at all because it's, of course, with my dad, as much as I am aware there was a lot of negligence on his part growing up, becoming a mother and being an adult and everything, I thought, okay, you know what? We can go past that and just try to sort of be mature adults, let's just say, and move forward, do the best that we can right now. Unfortunately, in his case, he's not able to do what he needs to do to be the father that I need and I want, in my life.
And how did that go between you and your dad, the actual breaking contact? Were you direct with him about that, or did you just kind of stop talking?
It was like a mixture of both, where it actually just started off with me just saying, you know what, I just need distance and space from you because of what you're doing. I cannot talk to you. And this happened during, let's say, over the summer, we had gone away on our holiday together as just the four of us as a family. And I said, I just need the space and I'm not going to be able to talk to you. Certainly while on vacation, don't expect any contact. And then it just sort of stopped. Like, I just felt like I don't want to reach out. I don't want to try. I don't have that space in my life right now. All my energy that I have, I really just want to keep and preserve for the people who are really, really important in my life. So certainly my kids. Again, I did not realize how much it was affecting me as a mother towards them, because there was this constant stress of having this relationship and this person who wasn't really living up to what I wanted my father to be.
Speaking of the people who you do want to give energy to, what has happened in your relationship with your husband and with your children since sharing your story?
With my husband, I'm very, very lucky that I have a very deep connection with Dan, to a point where sometimes I just am amazed by how much deep love he has for me, that I know I'm worthy of that love too, because I also love him just as much. Funnily enough, with me cutting contact with my dad, it has taken out so much stress from me, and my anxiety is also like sort of lessened a bit, that I'm able to give myself to him a bit more, have more space for him mentally and his needs and things. So that definitely I could see a big change in since this summer. And whereas with my children, of just knowing that I'm a little less angry at them. Still, my daughter might say that I'm still a bit more of the angry mom, but I'm the one who's trying to get them out the door in the morning. So I have my moments where I'm saying, please just get yourself ready. And actually, it's something that you said in a podcast a little while back, where you said, if I don't show kindness to myself, how can I ever show it to my child? I am really doing the best that I can with what I know and with what I have. And that is enough. Stop trying to put more on myself every single day. And, that I need to be more of this kind of a mother or more of that. I love my kids tremendously. And I'm really just doing the best that I can for them. And that, I think, giving myself grace has resulted in maybe, and I hope, giving them grace too. Just saying, okay, you're allowed to have your big emotions and everything, because that's always a bit of a trigger point, the big emotions, when you yourself are trying to unlearn how you handled those big emotions as a child and now having to relearn how to handle them better. So that's how I would say that I noticed things have now changed, certainly in the last 5 months with the family.
Wow. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot, but it's at the same time, this is where I want to be. This is how I wanted it to be. This is how I saw it. When I was dealing 2 years ago with really intense postnatal anxiety and depression, it was just this is not who I envisioned being at all, and of course that makes the depression only worse. but just now coming here and I can actually like look at my kids and enjoy just being in their presence. And there are moments in those days where it's like I'm in bed with my kids and my husband and we're just all cuddling together. And I was like, life cannot be more perfect than this right now. Like, how can it be that I'm here right now and I'm experiencing this? And it's just pure bliss. And I'm so grateful for that. And I'm having a lot more of those moments now than I did before.
That's so beautiful, Brinda.
Thanks, Jamie.
I want to play a clip from your original story on the podcast. You talk about the fact that you have very few personal items from your mom that you were gifted after her death. Just a few pieces of jewelry and a sweater, but not like her whole set of kitchen items, for example, and other things that a lot of Indian daughters would inherit.
Right.
There is one item in particular that you wish that you would have been given. And so I just want to play an excerpt from the original story.
Okay. All right.
And we'll listen to that and then come back together.
Okay. I think people don't necessarily understand why I need to know about her. Funnily enough, it's like what I would have actually wished was that my mom had written a letter to me. If she would have said something to me directly. Of course, it must not have been easy to know that you're dying and you're leaving behind 2 young children. My brother has memories of her. My aunt has memories of her. My dad has memories of her. Everyone has memories of her but me.
So you wish that you would have a letter from your mom. Is that still true for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Just something that was just from her to me.
So here's the thing, Brinda. I am totally just putting you in the hot seat right now.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
But I think you can handle it.
Okay.
I had this idea to challenge you and to challenge all of our listeners to write a letter to, in your case, maybe your children and other people who don't have children or, have another person in their life, to challenge you to write a letter directly to them about what you want them to know about you.
Okay.
To actually write a letter
Uh-huh.
and to report back. You don't have to tell us what's in the letter, but you could potentially take a photo snapshot of some portion of the letter or the outside or the envelope, something that proves that you've taken the challenge on. And I was wondering if you would be willing to do that before May 1st.
Yeah, definitely.
You'll do it?
Yeah, I'll do it. Because it's funny that you even said that, because it was just so a few days ago, but that I was thinking to myself, like, I don't know what came over me, or what would I tell my children? Like there was these words that went through my head and I was like, oh, I should put it down in a letter. Actually, no, sorry. Now I realize what it was. It was because, we have Christmas celebrations coming up, right? So we get together with the family, but that's when we do poems. We exchange our poems as well.
Which is a tradition in the Netherlands to write poems along with your gift.
Right. Yeah, along with your gift. And then I thought, oh, we haven't done a poem for the kids as yet this year, so maybe we should do it. And I was like, but if I do it, the problem is that it's going to be in English. It can be in any language, actually. But I was like, oh, but it would be in English. And then what would I say? But of course, there was so much emotion will be behind it. The few words that I can remember right now of just knowing of how they have been my absolute healers in my life. And it all started with, of course, meeting their dad. But yeah, they've just healed me in ways that I never thought was going to be possible by just their mere existence. But I will write a letter.
You will write a letter?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fantastic. So we are challenging you, the listeners, here with Brinda. Brinda has taken on the challenge to write a love letter to her kids. You can write your letter to your kids or your best friend or your great aunt who you love, whoever it is, where you want this person to know who you really are and what your life was about and why you love them. So that's the challenge. We will put more information in the end of the show about how to take part. But Brinda, thanks for doing the challenge. I'm going to do it too.
Okay.
So there'll be at least 2 of us.
All right. Okay. Great.
So Anything else that you want to share or want to say before we leave each other today?
For me, one thing I have to say is that, and I've said it before to you itself, that I really absolutely admire what you and Pete are doing over here of sharing these women's stories. What is so amazing is that every story that you guys have put out, there's been something that I could relate to. That, the experience is not the same, but the feeling or the emotion feels the same. Perhaps not feeling accepted or the feeling of anxiousness about something. And you just sort of connect with it. It's like, I know what it feels that. And just that small understanding of that feeling itself already makes you feel connected to another being. And I really appreciate that. It makes you feel a little less alone. Not that I feel alone in this world, but makes you feel more connected to more people. That's how I would say it. So I really appreciate that. And I just admire the work that you guys are doing. So thank you for that.
Our pleasure. I'll speak on behalf of both of us. Our pleasure, our passion, and hearing that from you makes me want to keep going.
Great.
And we will. Well, thank you so much, Brinda, for giving us an update.
Yeah. Thank you for checking in.
Thanks so much for listening to this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, we'd love it if you'd leave a rating or a review on Apple or directly on our website, which is ifyouknewme.show. As I noted in the episode, Brinda has accepted my letter writing challenge. You can take part in the challenge too. Just write one letter to your kids, your lover, your parent. Once you've written your letter, take a photo of it, the envelope or a corner of it, and post the image on Instagram or Facebook. Be sure to include a hashtag, Brinda Letter Challenge, and tag us too. You can read a bit more about the letter writing challenge on our blog. Last but not least, I want to thank our League of Women. At the end of 2022, we invited a select group of women leaders to help us expand and elevate this podcast with their time, talent, and resources. Our League members include Freda Hertz-Brown, Carrie Ahern, Christine Shook, Sister Monica Claire, Dawn Rude, Elizabeth Dorr, Kara Garner-Pass, and Karen McNeil. This podcast is produced by me, Jamie Younger, and my husband, Pete Herkmans. Thanks so much for listening to If You Knew Me. We'll be back with you next week.